2014 marks the 100-year anniversary of the First World War. It was a war of epic proportions with millions of lives lost. But on Christmas Day 100 years ago, something incredible happened. For a moment, the war stopped, and the British and Germans came together in an unofficial truce. On that day, an unlikely soccer game was played between the two sides. In this episode of Rise as One called World War Truce, we tracked down the descendants of the soldiers who organized the truce and heard stories of that incredible day in Belgium, where the power of sport managed to stop a war.
"100 years later, you can still visit the imprints of the Western Front of the First World War. In 1914, after a decade of building tensions throughout Europe, the fighting broke out. Young men became young soldiers. They descended from Great Britain and Germany towards one another, and then they dug in. In Ypres, in the Flanders region of Belgium, the sides' trenches were separated by no more than a few hundred feet, fighting to destroy one another close enough to share land the size of a single soccer field. The early battles of Ypres saw thousands of men from each side killed, but soon the pace of war changed, creating another foe for the soldiers: the conditions.
Living in a ditch is no fun, and trench life was miserable. Lice, rats, all kinds of foul-smelling remains of animals and men.
The conditions were absolutely appalling. All the trenches were very muddy, and my grandfather complains in his diary about the mud and the difficulty of pumping out the trenches.
In December 1914, British and German soldiers had been in the trenches for nearly 6 months. But with the holiday approaching, they yearned more than ever for normalcy.
The Germans made the first moves. The German officer involved, Lieutenant Zamisch, ordered his men to put Christmas trees on the tops of their trenches and to put candles and light those up.
Then my father called over, "Merry Christmas," and they responded, "Fröhlich Weihnachten."
On the face of it, trust seemed foolish, but for each side, faith in their fellow man somehow prevailed.
My father wrote in his diary that an Englishman came out of his trench with his hands up. He carried a hat full of English cigarettes and was unarmed. On this day, no shots were fired.
A day unique in the world's history. I met their officer and we arranged a local armistice for 48 hours. The soldiers on both sides met in their hundreds and exchanged greetings and gifts. One of the Royal Warwicks had been given a football as a Christmas present and took it out from the trench, and when the Germans and the British were milling around together, they suddenly started a spontaneous game of football. It was probably like a game of football at home.
For one day, desolation had been exchanged for hope, death for promise, weapons for a football. The focus, of course, wasn't on winning or losing, only a celebration of the boundless power of the game, a celebration that captivated every soldier on the front, including a 19-year-old private named Ernie Williams, who years later recounted the experience.
And then from somewhere, somehow, this football appeared. It was a proper football. And they kicked it about, they made a like goal, the one fellow went in goal, and then it was a general just kickabout, and everybody seemed to be enjoying themselves.
Christmas 1914, when the sounds of war were silenced, weapons were laid down, and a game flickered to life. The game that symbolized the life they'd left behind, the game that, despite everything else, linked them together as one.